So Nehemiah chapter 2, we'll begin reading together from the first verse of Nehemiah chapter 2. It says, in the beginning, in the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was brought for him, I took the wine and gave it to the king. I had not been sad in the presence before him. So the king asked me, "Why does your face look so sad when you are not ill? This can be nothing but sadness of the heart." I was very much afraid, but I said to the king, "May the king live forever. Why should my face not be sad when the city where my ancestors are buried lies in ruins and its gates have been destroyed by fire?" The king said to me, "What is it that you want?" Then I prayed to God, the God of heaven, and I answered the king, "If it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in his sight, let him send me to the city of Judah, where my ancestors are buried, so that I can rebuild it." Then the king, with the queen sitting beside him, asked me, "How long will your journey take, and when will you get back?" It pleased the king to send me, so I set a time. I also said to him, "If it pleases the king, may I have letters to the governors of Trans-Euphrates, so that they will provide me safe conduct until I arrive in Judah. And may I have a letter to Asaph, keeper of the royal park, so he will give me timber to make beams for the gates of the citadel, by the temple and for the city wall, and for the residence I will occupy." And because the gracious hand of my God was on me, the king granted my request. So I went to the governors of Trans-Euphrates and gave them the letters the king had given me. The king had also sent army officers and cavalry with me. When Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite official heard about this, they were very much disturbed that someone had come to promote the welfare of the Israelites. I went to Jerusalem, and after staying there 3 days, I set about during the night with a few others. I had not told anyone what my God had put in my heart to do for Jerusalem. There were no mounts with me except the one I was riding on. By night, I went out through the valley gate toward the jackal well and the dung gate, examining the walls of Jerusalem, which had been broken down, and its gates, which had been destroyed by fire. Then I moved on toward the fountain gate and the king's pool, but there was not enough room for my mount to get through. So I went up to the valley by night, examining the wall. Finally, I turned back and re-entered through the valley gate. The officials did not know where I had gone or what I was doing, because as of yet, I had not said anything to the Jews or to the priests or the nobles or officials or any others who will be doing the work. Then I said to them, "You see the trouble we are in? Jerusalem lies in ruins and its gates have been burned with fire. Come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, and we will no longer be a disgrace." I also told them about the gracious hand of my God on me and what the king had said to me. They replied, "Let us start rebuilding." So they began this good work. But when Sanballat the Horonite, Tobiah the Ammonite official, and Geshem the Arab heard about this, they mocked and ridiculed us. "What is this you are doing?" they asked. "Are you rebelling against the king?" I answered them by saying, "The God of heaven will give us success. We, his servants, will start rebuilding, but as for you, we have no share in Jerusalem or any claim or historic right to it." So last week, we covered up through verse 9 of the second chapter. And for context, I always like to start where we leave off, so we're able to know where we're picking it up. And verse 9 says that, "So I went to the governors of Trans-Euphrates and gave them the letters the king had given me. The king had also sent an army of officers and cavalry with me." So Nehemiah had already prayed. The whole first chapter, we know that most of it is his prayer that he spent And for the beginning of the chapter, we know that the time that he starts praying, it was in about the time of winter time. And when he gets his answer over in chapter 2, it's springtime. So he spent about 4 months in prayer. And it wasn't just any prayer, 5-minute prayer. He prayed and fasted for 4 months. Now, Nehemiah has a very important position or office in the kingdom. And he knows that God had been placing a burden upon his heart. And he wanted to make sure that it was God calling him. Not that he was doubting him, not that he wasn't sure or did not recognize God's voice, but he wanted to make sure what that calling was. When he went to Jerusalem, he probably arrived with Asaph, the keeper of the forest. And he told them, we're here to get as much timber as we need to rebuild the walls, to rebuild the city. And obviously, he probably told them, no way, you ain't getting no wood from here, no timber, unless you got an official letter from the king. And I could imagine Nehemiah went like this, well, here it is. There's the seal from the king and his signature. And Asaph would have gone, wow, it is true. Come on in, my friend. Have as many timber as you want. And see, those 4 months were vital for Nehemiah that he spent in prayer. Because he didn't only just start praying and waited upon prayer. He was also planning how his trip was going to be. He knew, because of the position he was in, he knew a lot of these people that he probably knew were going to oppose him. Or he knew what was going to get in his way. That is one of the reasons why he asked for letters. So that there would be as minimal opposition as possible, even though he knew that this was going to happen. I mentioned last week about how when somebody's called into the missionary field, they don't simply go out and say, you know what, God called me to the missionary field, go drop me off in the middle of Africa, just parachute me down. They don't just go out there not knowing where they're going to land. They got to plan out where they're going to go. They got to have some equipment with them, some food, some basic supplies, clothing, some type of shelter. And if you remember what I mentioned about Pastor Chris when he was down here, he mentioned about how if God is calling you, you're not going to rely upon a ministry to support you. Yes, there might be support financially from a ministry, but if God is calling you, He's also going to prepare you. But not only prepare you, He's also going to prepare you. He's not only going to provide for you, but He's also going to prepare you mentally, physically, emotionally. Because you're going to a place that you probably haven't been there before. Maybe others have. So God is going to bring those people along your side to say, okay, this is what I faced. This is what you need to watch out for. And so on. But he said we're not going to rely on monetary. A lot of the times it's not going to be a ministry that's going to fund you. And if that is God's calling, He will provide. So Nehemiah spent all this time in prayer, asking God, is it you? Is it you? Verse 10 says that when Sanballat, the Horonite, and Tobiah, the Ammonite official, heard about this, they were very much disturbed that someone had come to promote the welfare of the Israelites. Now here there's two people that are opposing already. Later on we're going to see, I'm just going to skip really quick to to verse 19 of the same chapter. It says, but when Sanballat the Horonite, Tobiah the Ammonite official, now there's Geshem the Arab, heard about this, they mocked and ridiculed. Later on, we're going to see that there's even more people. I had mentioned also last week about how, we're in our country, we're in a time where everybody wants to be a part of a minority. We make ourselves a victim, including us Christians. We make ourselves victims. We live in a country where we have so many freedoms and we abuse those freedoms. I mentioned how the LGBT community, they're fighting so hard for their supposedly minority to be allowed into men's or women's restroom wherever they feel like it. And how if we simply say we're Christians or we want to print a poster or something, a scripture, no, we can't do that. So these people, these minorities, Nehemiah was actually fighting for a minority at the time because they had just came out of captivity. The Jews had just came out of captivity. So Ezra, he was already rebuilding the temple. And we saw how he began to rebuild the temple. And at the same time, somebody had started rebuilding the walls and they destroyed them. But Nehemiah was now being called from God to go and rebuild his walls. And these guys, Sanballat and Tobiah, they're quick to oppose. Whenever we get a calling, a ministry gets put in our heart, or a burden, or for somebody, something good, something that is God's calling, something that He puts in our hearts, we always get opposition. Simple example, the retreats. When we go to the retreats, men or women, right away there's some kind of opposition. And we may look at it and seem like, okay, well, this is legit. I can't go to the retreat because of my job or because of my child or whatever it is. There's always going to be opposition. And not just one little thing. When a ministry gets on its way, there's always somebody or something, obviously we know it comes from the enemy, that gets envious of what's being started and they come to oppose. They'll make as much effort to give a bad image to the person or to the ministry. Nehemiah had this burden for these people who were pretty much disappearing. They were dying off. They were living in these ruins. And though somebody was rebuilding the temple, without these walls, there was no point to rebuilding the temple. There was no point of having something valuable inside this temple, because without the walls, they could go into the temple and destroy or vandalize or steal. In those days, in the ancient times, the walls were very critical. Obviously, they were very critical because they were used to protect themselves from any enemy, any other country. Applying it to our own personal lives, the walls of our own lives, the walls of our own walk with Christ, the walls with our own family, our relationships with our wives, our husbands, our friends, co-workers. You know, those walls, I should say, you know, I don't doubt that most of us on Sunday service, both services, and here today, we're all born again believers. And we'll have a good foundation, which is Christ. But just like Nehemiah said that these walls were broken down and this rubble, they were destroyed by fire. How do our walls look? Do we have that foundation? I look at the people that sometimes we sit down and talk with, and we look at them, or we see people that have left, and we look at their lives and we see like, what happened? You know, we know that your foundation is in Christ. Why is there so much shambles? Why is there so much pain? What led to this point where your walls are in utter ruins? And later on, we're going to see this Tobiah being opposing again. There's so many examples that we can use as far as to how the enemy likes to oppose. See, when we, at least here at this church on the south side, in order for us to grow, and I'm not talking a number, in order for us to grow spiritually, we can't just simply be coming to church on Wednesdays or Sundays. We can't just simply know the Bible from beginning to the end. That only makes you religious. It's not about religion. It's about your relationship with Christ and your walk with Christ. And in order for us to grow spiritually, we need to get rid of that rubble. We need to get rid of all those ruins that are hindering for us to get back to the foundation. I mentioned to you guys not too long ago about what the vision God had placed in my heart, and how in order for us to grow again spiritually, we need to start with the simplest things that our church needs. You know, He placed in my heart to develop leaders, which I mentioned to you. I don't know how to do that. I don't know how to do that, but He does. And if He said, you're going to develop leaders, then He's going to do it through me. Now, there's also got to be some structure to our church. Just like these walls have doors to get through. There's many gates. There's a pool. There's a water gate. There's a dunk gate. Later on, we're going to see the significance of each one of these gates. They all have a meaning spiritually, what they mean. But just how these walls have a different gate, and they all represent something. We, structurally as a church, we also need to have certain people in certain positions, not to make an organization and be strong like a business. No. We need to have people in place that are going to be taking care of, you know, the cleaning, the ushers, the elders, people who are going to be there to pray with the herding lambs and the sheep. If we're simply going to be coming to church and making it a checkoff list, oh, I made it to church, I'm done, then it may sound pretty harsh, but you can just go down the street and go to another church. At least as far as it depends on me being led by Christ, my responsibility is to teach the Bible, to teach the Word, to lead these people. Another thing that I lack on is in being an encourager. And Nehemiah, though he's a man of few words, he's going to encourage the people. Later on, we're going to see that he encourages the people to rebuild these walls. And then, if back then there was the Guinness World Records, he could be in the Guinness World Records of rebuilding a wall in 52 days. Not him himself, but the entire city. And just like he is only one man, he didn't rebuild it by himself. I'm only one man. I can't be the only one in this church that knows how to pray or knows how to read the Bible. Verse 11, it says, I went to Jerusalem. And there should be a period right here. It says, where it should read, I went to Jerusalem, period. Because Nehemiah heard this calling, this burden on his heart. So now he's saying, I actually went. Many of us will get a calling and will procrastinate, and eventually that calling will fade away. It will be gone. The Lord may not want to use you. He's not done with you, but He may not want to use you in a certain ministry or a certain calling. So Nehemiah actually got up. I mean, he was in a comfortable place at the kingdom. He was number 2 person. He was the cupbearer. He's number 2 person in the kingdom. So he had anything and everything to his disposition. He didn't have to come 800 plus miles to rebuild his walls. He didn't grow up there. But he says, I went to Jerusalem. So that means he left his couch. He turned off Netflix. He turned off whatever it was. He left his comfort zone to answer that call that God had placed on his heart. He says, I went to Jerusalem, and after staying there 3 days. Now he says that he was there 3 days. It doesn't say what he was doing. And I'm pretty sure after 800 plus miles of traveling, he was probably tired. He didn't have jet lag. Maybe he had horse lag or camel lag, however he got there. But he probably wasn't just resting. I'm pretty sure, I have a good idea that he began in prayer. That God was talking to him again. He probably arrived, and he didn't say, what next, God? He said, now what, God? See, Nehemiah wasn't an activist. An activist is a person that acts quick. He doesn't think it through, and when it's too late, he looks back and like, man, I should have thought these things through. Nehemiah, you could say he took baby steps. And he was here again 3 days in prayer. Again, after 4 months, he's in prayer again. Waiting for God to tell him what was he supposed to do. See, when I set myself to prayer, I mentioned that a lot of the times when it's my personal time to pray, my study, it seems like it wants to get interrupted. And just like Jesus Christ, He Himself had to go away from His disciples, away from the crowd in order to be before God the Father, to be refreshed, to hear from Him. Nehemiah had to do the same thing. He had to go away from the people that he came with, to be alone again, to hear from God again, to be refreshed. We need our own time every day to be refreshed. I know a lot of us wait until we go on retreats and get refreshed. Or we wait until the weekend and then we completely become couch bumps. And we don't do nothing. Well, that's not really refreshing. I understand we may have jobs that are physically tiring or mentally exhausting. But where's the prayer? Where's the time in the Word? Flare prayers are not always good. If that's what we do every single time something comes up, then we're missing out on everything that God has for us. Yeah, Peter prayed a flare prayer when he was sinking in the water. Nehemiah prayed before the king, but he had already been praying before talking to the king. That was a flare prayer. But he goes on and prays 3 more days. He's before God again. 3 more days. Verse 12 says, I set out during the night with a few others. I had not told anyone what my God had put in my heart to do for Jerusalem. There was no mount with me except the one I was riding in. It says, my God had put in my heart. So that wasn't Nehemiah's ministry. That was God's ministry. And he was called to do the work in this ministry. This is not my church. This is God's church. He's called me to lead a people. But this is not our church. This is his church. So he says, my God put in my heart. There was no mount with me except the one I was riding. No one else had been with him. And one of the things that I've noticed, or I've been learning so far, is that I need to stay quiet more often than I speak when it comes to matters of God, burdens or prayer requests that God places in my heart. Because if I say what I feel or what I think God has placed in my heart and it's the wrong thing, then I'm going to look like a fool, which is fine. But then they're going to look at, well, then you're really not listening to God, or God is doing something wrong. So before I say anything, I'm learning to stay quiet. Not to just blurt out. Myself may have so many ideas of what I would like to do here at church. But he has way better ideas. Plans, actually, that he's already got set. So he had not told anyone yet what he was doing. There was no mounts with me except the one I was riding on. Verse 13 says that by night I went out through the valley gate. Now does this say if it was during those 3 nights or 3 days that he was there that he went out at night? It simply says that he went out at night through the valley gate toward the jackal well and the dung gate, examining the walls of Jerusalem. Notice here the word examining. Later on he uses it again. It says, which had been broken down, and its gates which have been destroyed by fire. Then it moved on toward the fountain gate and the king's pool, but there was not enough room for my mount to get through. So I went up the valley by night, examining the wall. Finally I turned back and re-entered through the valley gate. The word examine, it's a medical term that is used, that a doctor, a nurse, or somebody in the field may use in order to probe the disease, the injury, to see what type of damage has been done, sickness, to probe, to see what or how severe something is. So he was examining the walls. He had not been in Jerusalem. He had heard about it. So he goes on through the valley gate. Notice how he came back through the valley gate again. And the word examining, he needed to see. He needed to see how bad these walls were. Now it says that the walls were destroyed by fire. Now if you know anything about bricks or brick making, you know that you have to use fire in order to harden the brick. So if the walls were on fire, that means they were severely destroyed. And then there was no room for his mount. That means he had to get off his horse to walk around. We've seen how many natural disasters happen. You know, Houston right now is flooded. Katrina, it's happened. Earthquakes in California. Earthquakes in Japan. Ecuador recently. And all these other natural disasters here, you know, not too far from here also. Hondo. And all these other little towns, Floresville. And we can see how the destruction went through, you know, and ravaged these little small towns or cities or countries. And we can see and literally say with the right proper term, oh my God. And see how severe this destruction is. That's probably what Nehemiah said when he saw this rubble. Oh my God. And again, I can use this term in people's lives and see how I looked up to certain people and look at where they're at now. And I can say, oh my God, how did this happen? Why is there so much pain? Why is there so much rubble in their lives? Verse 14, it says that, then I moved on toward the fountain gate and the king's pool, but there was not enough room for my mount to get through. So I went up to the valley by Ignite, examining the wall. Finally, I turned back and re-entered through the valley gate. The officials did not know where I had gone or what I was doing, because as of yet I had said nothing to the Jews or the priests or the nobles or the officials or any other who would be doing the work. See, one of the reasons I believe he went out at night, and he didn't tell anybody, of course, because he was waiting for God. But one of the reasons I believe and it's not in the Bible, it's not written there, this is just my personal opinion, is because at night, mostly everybody's asleep. It's quiet. You know, early in the morning when it's still dark, the day hasn't started, it's quiet, you're able to read your Bible, you're able to hear from God. He went out. He wanted to have no distraction, to see and in detail examine the walls. Another reason why I believe he went out at night is because he didn't want to cause any commotion. He didn't tell anybody what he was doing, not the officials, not the people who were there with him. So obviously he didn't want to cause any commotion, because he, holding a high position with the king, you know, you can imagine he arrives at this ruin of a town, of a city, and he arrives, he didn't just arrive by himself, he arrived with the Calvary, with other horsemen. But they're probably looking at him and like, what is he doing here? You know, what is he doing? You know, in my workplace, where you go about your day every day, doing work, and all of a sudden HR shows up. When HR shows up, that means something's going on. They don't come around that often, so when they do, it's because somebody's going to get the axe, or somebody's going to get written up. So people on the floor are like, what are they doing here? You know, so Nehemiah shows up, and like they were probably talking, what is he doing here? He's the cupbearer of the king. You know, so I'm pretty sure Nehemiah didn't want to cause any more commotion. And the third reason why I believe he went out at night is because he didn't want the discouragement, the insults to start so soon. He knew those were going to come. He wanted to make sure that while examining the walls, he had a good look at what needed to be done. Now he was examining the walls, and he was probably looking at this rubble here. There's fire there. There's so much weeds growing there. So he was probably looking at who can do what can be done. And later on, we're going to see that everybody rebuilds the walls right in front of their house. Right in front of the house. They didn't leave. They didn't travel too far away to rebuild the walls. So they begin the work. And Nehemiah, I mentioned that he's a man of small words. But later on, we're going to see that when he speaks, people are listening. And when he speaks the things of God. So when Tobiah shows up, and later on the other people show up, he tells them, what are you doing here? Leave me alone. You have nothing to do with this. We're going to rebuild the walls and we're going to succeed. Yes, they're going to insult him. They're going to make all kinds of ruckus to oppose him. But he tells them, leave us alone. Leave us alone. We're doing God's work. And he is going to succeed. Now it's up to us to allow God to do the work through us. We really have no choice. Actually, we don't have a choice. If God tells us to do something, puts a burden in our heart, we have no choice. We have the freedom to disobey, but we have no choice. God says, this is what I placed for you to do, but you have the freedom to disobey. Let's pray.